Welcome everyone to the IEA Bioenergy webinar series hosted by the Canadian Institute of Forestry. My name is Ronnie Huang and I'll be kicking off today's session. Today is September 13th, 2018, and we are very pleased to have Inga Stupak with us today who will present on approaches to gain trust in sustainability of bioenergy through credible governance, results from collaboration with an IEA Bioenergy and other research networks. We are also very pleased to have Professor Tat Smith from the University of Toronto, who will be the moderator for today's session. To start things off, Dr. Inga Stupak is an associate professor in the environmental impacts of wood energy production systems at the University of Copenhagen, who is also the Danish national leader in the research network IEA Bioenergy Task 43. And with that, I'd like to pass it over to Tat.
Thanks very much, Ronnie, and welcome colleagues to this webinar. We're really pleased to present the results of a collaboration to you today and really looking forward to some good discussion. What I'll do as moderator is introduce the collaboration that's been taking place for the past 3 years to you, and then I'll turn it over to Inga, who will present a series of slides, and then at the end of Inga's presentation, when Ronnie opens it up again for questions and discussion, then I'll help work with Inga to work through your questions and make sure we get a lively discussion. You'll probably have noticed there's some opportunity for introducing questions through chats and a variety of ways in which the webinar works, and so we're really looking forward to a lively discussion. So Ronnie's introduced the title, and this, you can see that on this first slide. What I might emphasize in the title here is that we're really looking to develop sustainable bioenergy production systems. And the question is, how can the collective community involved in this actually create trust in the sustainability of these systems? And we'll be talking about what the role is of governance in that. So this collaboration that we're referring to has been one that's been quite enjoyable. Inga and my base in this research project is tied most immediately to the IEA Bioenergy program, and we've had interaction with colleagues in what's referred to as Task 43. This is a collection of colleagues working on developing biomass feedstocks for energy markets, and within that there's a strong focus on sustainability and governance of these feedstock development systems. Within IEA Bioenergy, there's many tasks. There's about a dozen that are working through a 3-year period, and oftentimes we come together in what are referred to as intertask projects. And the first bullet here you can see relates to a current project led by Martin Joninger from Utrecht. The title of that is Measuring, Governing, and Gaining Support for Sustainable Bioenergy Supply Chain. So this collaboration, this intertask project, has enabled us to assemble colleagues who are focused on this with a wide variety of disciplinary strength and backgrounds. And we were also effectively able to, really fortunate to link with other colleagues throughout Nordic and Baltic countries, and had a workshop in Copenhagen in April of this year. And that conference in Copenhagen brought together colleagues from IEA Bioenergy, also from the SNS-NKJ network, which deals with the effects of bioenergy production from forests and agricultural systems on ecosystem services in the Nordic and Baltic landscapes. We also collaborated in this workshop with what's referred to as the CARS network, or the Center of Advanced Research on Environmental Services from Nordic forest ecosystems. So this has been really quite enjoyable. As the slide points out, we came together in a conference in April of this year. So this webinar today builds on that collaboration and draws from it. In the design of the InterTask project that I made reference to, we decided in the early days of this project to focus on a series of supply chains that were very important in meeting the global bioenergy production targets and demands. So this map basically shows you those supply chains, and you can see that the green colors in the vectors here relate to supply chains for forest biomass. The ag production systems, of course, are quite important in meeting global targets for bioenergy, and there was a number of projects within this collaboration then that dealt with agricultural production systems in Canada, the U.S., and must be a dot hidden here for Europe, but also in Europe. And because biogas is such an important contribution and could be a bigger contribution to meeting our renewable energy demand, this collaboration also included work related to biogas production systems in Denmark and in Germany. And then so this map hopefully shows you how ambitious this project was in terms of its comprehensively dealing with supply chains around the world, and representing not only the major sectors, forestry, agriculture, biogas production systems, which would meet those renewable energy needs, but covering a wide variety of geographies and governments as well. So our attempt here was to be comprehensive globally in this work. To give you a feeling for the number of papers that are being published by colleagues working in these collaborations, we wanted to share a couple lists with you. So I hope this is not too daunting, but also might be a useful reference for you as you come back to these slides perhaps in the future to see what's going on and determine who you might like to be in touch with to pursue questions that you might have. But this list of 14 papers is a series of papers that are being published within what's referred to as Objective 2 within the InterTask project. You can see in the second column there what supply chain these papers relate to. So labels for forestry and agriculture, depending on where these papers are based, and biogas as well. So colleagues who are working on these papers have had a couple of meetings through the course of this 3-year period, and the work that we're presenting today then draws from this. So you can see it's a rich collaboration. 2, we've done our best to draw from this work then to make this presentation for you today. Within the program that took place in Copenhagen, there was, as we mentioned, the networks from Nordic and Baltic countries met in collaboration with the InterTask project there in Copenhagen in April. And here's a list of some of the papers that have been presented from that work that's going on. And you can see then that this includes forestry, agriculture in these different countries as well. You can see here also a paper related to the forestry in Japan. So we share this with you to make it clear that, 1, we're trying to be comprehensive with respect to the important supply chains. 2, that we're trying to be representative of the major production sectors that are involved in this. But 3, as we deal with topics of governance and sustainability, then you can see this is a rich mix of countries and cultures, which of course are quite critical to coming up with sustainable systems and ones that actually build on this richness in culture. The conference that I referred to in Copenhagen, this is a web page from that, and so provides links for you to be able to reach back into the book of abstracts, presentations, and posters that were presented there. Many of the papers that I just showed you in those first 2 slides are being published in a special issue of the journal Energy, Sustainability, and Society, and those papers are being written as we speak and submitted now. So this work that we're presenting here today really draws from all this that's been going on. So I'll acknowledge then, on behalf of Inga, myself, and our collaborators, that this presentation is the fruit of more than 3 years worth of work together on issues related to sustainability. We're very indebted to the collaboration and with our colleagues in these networks and support that we've had. And although we're trying to be comprehensive in our presentation here today, we might have as a disclaimer that there's no attempt to comprehensively include all the emerging knowledge. So I encourage you to reach out to those works as they're published. So let me turn this presentation now over to Inga, who will be presenting the results of this work to you. Inga, can you hear me?
I can. Thank you, Ted, for giving the background for this work. What I'm going to do here, some more names here that people that are going to submit these papers. You've seen the list already there, and people who actually participated in the conference. So the overall aim of the part of the INTERTASK project that we've been working with was we set out to build theory on how to increase the granting and achieving of trust and legitimacy of sustainability governance systems for bioenergy and the bioeconomy. So trying to see if we can see some patterns across geographies and different supply chains in what creates trust and legitimacy of governance. And we set out to do that, as you could see, by studying governance systems in various parts of the world, and also for various supply chains and at different scales as well. And try to identify also how data and scientific knowledge, many of us come from a natural science background and try to move into this area, which is quite new to some of us. So how can our data feed into these governance systems in a way that also helps to create trust in the systems? And then I also want to emphasize that this webinar is also meant to be a forum for discussion. So this is preliminary work, so any comments and feedback on what I'm presenting is most welcome. So the presentation here will evolve around some emerging themes that we've seen come out of these studies as we start to look across them. Some key points. You will find some more in the presentation also that was given at the EU BCE conference earlier this year. So here is only a selection of those themes that we've been discussing. The first one is that that the definition of the concepts and terms that are being used in governance and in this discussion, it's not trivial. You need to be careful to communicate to people how you define, for example, sustainability. Another point is that maybe sustainability is not dealt with in a completely holistic manner. Maybe it's not comprehensive enough, even if it's expanding all the time. Next, we can see that sustainability governance is not something static. It's more dynamic than we had maybe thought it was, and also that it's developing with the markets as they develop. So the financial incentives put in place develop the market, and sustainability governance tends to develop with these markets. And then we've also looked into the design of different governance systems and looked into flexibility. Here it means, is it mandatory or voluntary systems, and also how prescriptive they are, how precise are they in what they require. And one of the points we thought maybe it was different, but it's not easy to see how the prescriptiveness is maybe linked to the trust and legitimacy of the system or in the system. It might be linked, but it's not clear yet, at least for what we can see now. But what we can see is that a mix of approaches is often used, so mandatory and voluntary systems sit in the same space. And some requirements might be quite prescriptive, while others are more system-based. The next is that voluntary approaches are gaining more acceptance for part of the supply chain through a relatively new approach, risk assessment. which means that you deal with the issues at a larger scale, not for the individuals in the supply chain. Then databases and for documentation of sustainability seems to be emerging, and not only databases for one system, but databases that can be used across different systems to document the requirements of each system. And what we also can see is that the existing monitoring systems that has been put in place for various reasons, they are increasingly being used for documenting sustainability also against the voluntary sustainability standards. So I'm going to develop these arguments a little bit more. First, the concepts and terms, how we define them. So sustainability governance, we define that as a set of regulatory processes, mechanisms, and organizations that seek to influence sustainable actions and outcomes. And it also means that it's a very broad definition. It can be governmental laws and acts and ordinances, and it can be certification systems. It can be best management practices. It can be company policies. So a very wide range of systems that all seek to influence and create more sustainable outcomes. And starting out with the most basic one, which we maybe think that we know what we mean when we say sustainability, but when you start to discuss the specifics, it's maybe not so obvious. We have the definition from the Brundtland report, which probably all of you know. A sustainable development intends to ensure that the environmental, social, and economic needs of the future are not compromised to meet the needs of the present. So that is at some level easy to understand, but when we start to discuss what it means on the ground, it's much more complicated, and there will be a lot of trade-offs, and we cannot optimize on all parameters. So we redefined it for a more specific purpose as continual improvement, where the best available opportunities are used to achieve specific targets that needs to be set. We should identify these opportunities through scientific analysis. They should be based on criteria and indicators that are prioritized by current stakeholders, and they should be better than other options, including the business as usual. And then they will very often be context specific for a time and a place and a set of conditions, which means that there is not one single definition of sustainability when you get to these very specific levels. So it's also a moving target in time. Our priorities can change over time. So it varies in space and time what is understood exactly by sustainability. Trust is another word that we've used. We can define it as the willingness to be vulnerable to the actions of another. That's a very general one. If it's more in a governance context, we can say it's the belief of the community that a given governance institution and its conduct are appropriate. And in this table, you can see a system that we try to put together on how trust can be achieved, how it can be granted, and how it can be achieved at different levels among individuals, organizations, and governments. And what we will focus on is as organizations and how they are granted trust by individuals and the public, and also governance. If they put together or put in place governance, how can they achieve the trust by individuals and the public that what is the systems put in place that really lead to more sustainable outcomes. Another word that I used is legitimacy, which you could say is a precondition for achieving trust. So we define legitimacy as society accepting a governance institution as an authoritative figure that can influence the actions of the societal actors. and also that these actors are willing to obey the rules of the governing institution. And the literature separates different types of legitimacy so that you can talk about it in a more nuanced way. Input legitimacy, which is about gaining consent of the actors through the participation. So it's you could say it's the democratic content of the system. The output is about how effective it is and how successful it is in achieving the goals it was put in place to achieve. And throughput is, among other, about how effective is the administration of these systems and what are the resources needed to achieve the goals. So this is a precondition to obtain trust that the systems are legitimate and that they are perceived as legitimate. In this presentation, we will mostly focus on the output and the throughput legitimacy. So the question is now, how can we achieve or ensure trust and legitimacy of sustainable practices for these, as you could say, cyclic bioenergy systems? And we've chosen to separate between, you could say, three macro supply chains: forest bioenergy, plant-based agricultural bioenergy, and biogas. And this leads to the next point here, that sustainability is not dealt with in a holistic manner. And let me try to elaborate what I mean by that. And I'm starting with the case study on the list that we showed you before that gave rise to this point. It's manure-based biogas production in Denmark, and the production of biogas here was actually set in place or invented to deal with an environmental problem. So with a lot of animal farming, there was nitrate pollution due to the high production of manure. So ways were sought who could deal with this in a better manner. So biogas was seen as a way to treat the manure and bring it back to the fields, and in that way reduce the nitrate leaching to groundwater. And at the same time produce biogas as a renewable form of energy. And this made it quite clear that the incentives put in place is part of sustainability governance. Often the financial incentives put in place to promote bioenergy are seen as something separate from the sustainability. And we will argue here that the financial incentives and what they try to achieve, that's actually part of the sustainability governance. So you can see here the G's in the previous figure. They were identified groups of sustainability issues or governance that was dealt with at different places in the supply chain. So you can see these here. SG1, sustainability of plant-based feedstock produced in the field. Then something about the animal slurry, manure and slurry feedstock, how that is treated. Sustainable plant operation, and also the taking care that there is not leakage of emissions from the biogas plant. And finally, the sustainable recycling of the digestate as a biofertilizer. But then we also chose in the end to include the financial incentives here as a part of sustainability governance. And if we look at forestry systems, traditional forest certification systems as the FSC and the PEFC, then this is not really a part of the standard. They do include many other things. Here you have a system that has been developed by the WWF International, trying to assess the strength of different certification systems. And you can see the categories that they include here. You will find the same categories as in the original Brundtland report. There are some social categories, some environmental issues, and also economic. And That's in the standard strength. So you can also see the FSC has been evaluated here. You can see how the strength of those standards were evaluated. So very high for some issues, but less, for example, for pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. The system strength is another thing. That's about how the system has been put together. Is the standard setting a democratic procedure? Is the procedures of the system, are they transparent? Are they being communicated well? Are the certification bodies, are they accredited, and so on? So it's more a system criteria. So that's one way to assess the strength of a governance system. And if we look, try to simplify it a little bit now, and again look at forest management certification. We have something here which is about the democratic content, communication and transparency, something about legality, workers and use rights, and sustainable forest management. Just a very simplified way to express that. If we then look at newer standards for forest biomass and bioenergy certification and the sustainability of bioenergy feedstocks, then they try to include some new elements because these other systems were not comprehensive enough for this purpose. One thing is biological diversity at a more landscape level, ecosystem carbon also more at the landscape level. Are we changing the levels of carbon in the forest ecosystem? And then especially energy and greenhouse gas emission savings along the supply chain is a new aspect of these systems. What we will then argue now is that maybe we need to be even more comprehensive. We need also to look at the energy systems and if they are sustainable in some manner. The whole system design and the role of the biomass in the system, what criteria do we need to put in place to say that bioenergy is used here in the system in a sustainable way? And we can also talk about the financial viability. Is there sustainability in that sense, and are there incentives maybe needed to develop these systems rather than fossil fuel systems? So we tried very briefly here just to suggest some criteria for energy systems and financial viability. It should be seen as a straw doc, so just for open discussion, do we need this and what should it be if that's the truth? Can we bring things together here so that we discuss the use of bioenergy as a sustainability parameter in the same way as we discuss sustainability of the impacts of the feedstock harvesting and production in the field, in the same way as we discuss economic and social and environmental aspects in traditional forest certification standards and have this together. So suggestions here include financial viability of renewable technologies, that bioenergy in a particular supply chain must be the most economic or the most environmentally friendly or socially acceptable renewable energy solution. And also, if there are no environmental and social issues, then financial incentives should perhaps be technology neutral to allow for the most economic solution for society. On the other hand, if there are environmental and social issues, then it might be a better idea that the financial incentives favor those technologies that has the least unintended effect. And finally, it should also, we suggest that it should be discussed how the government and how subsidies can, or financial incentives, how the government can exit those means again and adapt it to a market condition. And again, through an adaptive framework where it's all the time evaluated if incentives are needed and if they are designed in the way that is most optimal or sustainable for society. That leads to the next point here, that that these systems develop over time. It's not something you put in place and then it doesn't change. You don't have to change it later. Sustainability governance incentivize development of bioenergy, and by sustainability governance here, I mean the financial incentives, or in some other manners, creating better conditions for financial viability of bioenergy, and that interacts with the market that creates incentives for developing sustainability governance through these different phases of market development. And it's often about mitigating the trade-offs or making the trade-offs. An example of this is a study of biogas in Germany, where Daniela Trenn and her colleagues identified 3 phases of market development: initiation, market buildup, and consolidation phases, and also have looked at how governance developed through these phases, how the Renewable Energy Act helped. It put in place incentives for biogas that started that made the biogas sector develop. And these incentives were strengthened in the next version of the Renewable Energy Act. And then finally, new revisions were made in 2009 in the consolidation phase. And what happened through these different phases was that especially that energy crops were used for the early plants. It was a major feedstock, whereas it later showed up that it was undesired to the extent that the energy crops was used. And they are now into a phase called greening, where they try to reduce the amount of energy crops for biogas production and instead favor the use of manure. So the consolidation phase is much about this greening more than actually increasing the amount of biogas at the current stage. It's also about liberalization, so having government exit the system so that incentives are phased out, and so that biogas can work on a more market basis. Throughout these revisions of the legislation, different challenges were identified, such as the challenge with the energy crops. And all the time, a monitoring system has been in place to follow the development, and the legislation has a built-in adaptive feature that requires that it's revised with a regular frequency. And that was a quite surprising and unusual feature for some of us, that this adaptive approach was built in. What you can maybe not see so clearly here, but what this figure also tries to tell is that you can see it says RIA and in different years. That's the energy legislation, but the other ones are agricultural legislation. And for these agricultural legislations, there was no monitoring system, so they tended to be a little bit behind, or to be behind all the time, because there was no monitoring system in place to give heads up when something undesirable was developing. We could see the same in a biogas study from Denmark, where 4 major phases of policy and market development was identified. A pioneering phase where there were no incentives, and it was more enthusiasts and early entrepreneurs that could see the potentials of this technology. Then political incentives, financial incentives were put in place, and there was a build-up phase with innovation and support for development, where it started to take off. There was a change in government, and the focus was now more on energy security and economic growth, and less on sustainability. And there was an emphasis on liberalization, so no state support for these renewable technologies, and that caused some stagnation of the market development. Then again, in 2009, the green growth strategy was decided, and the part of this was that 50% of the manure produced in Denmark should be used for energy. And together with a new energy agreement some years later, that helped to create the framework for a new development phase, you could say, for biogas. So that is where it stands today, and we're now awaiting a new energy agreement with some uncertainty, but still the market has taken off again here. So the way the Danish governance complex, you could say, the way it was challenged and reshaped was, especially in the early phases, was through interaction between all the actors in the biogas arena. So a platform was put in place where you could exchange, they could exchange experiences, and this helped a quick development of the sector. So there were no dedicated monitoring systems, but this exchange of experiences also had a positive impact on developing and adjusting things that did not work optimally. Then I'm changing to forest now, also to look at how dynamic governance can be. And the special thing is here that we have a very long time series. You can see from 1903, forest legislation in Sweden, and the authors here, Lindahl et al., identified 3 periods of developments in Swedish forest legislation. The first phase was focused on protection against forest degradation. So what all countries have experienced, the overutilization of the forest, and the phase where legislation is put in place to reestablish the forest and the forest production. So in the next period, focus was on the forest production and raw materials for the industry. And you can see here that a number of requirements were put in place. There should be a notice of clear filling, mandatory cleaning of the stands, mandatory planting if regeneration is sparse, mandatory thinning, mandatory cutting of old forests, and also a mandatory forest management plan. So some requirements really to speed up the production of wood for the industry. And then the legislation enters a third phase where there is, after the Rio Summit, where there is more focus on other environmental objectives, so biodiversity, water, soil, and so on. And during this period, we had the oil crisis, and the use of forest biomass for energy also took off, which led to the development of recommendations also for forest biomass harvesting, and for that to take place in a sustainable manner. So if we look at the development of the harvesting during that period, you can also see these different phases. Forest protection, where you're starting to, where you protect the forest. This forest production period, where you really where they try to speed up the production for the industry. And then a phase here where environmental objectives are added. And what's quite interesting to see is that the production is not decreasing because of these environmental objectives. Another issue that has emerged is the import in some countries of wood fuels. Denmark is one example, the UK, Netherlands, and Belgium are other examples and Italy of these imports. And this has also created a new market situation, and it created a new need for governance as well. So what has been put in place in Denmark, for example, is an industry agreement for sustainable wood chips and wood pellets, which all biomass used in Danish energy plants must comply with. So this is under implementation at the moment, and at the same time we have the Renewable Energy Directive from the EU that where some new sustainability criteria have also been adopted. It's not implemented yet, but from 2020 that will begin as well. Also, the UK has a system in place. It's already implemented for sustainable use of forest biomass for energy. And all this sits on top of the more traditional forest legislation and forest certification systems and best management practices for forestry. So a new development also for forest energy. So when we look at all these systems and how it changed over time, we tried to put together a hypothesis about phases of governance development. First, having a phase where the governance systems emerge, which is linked to the market initiation, sometimes activated by financial incentives. And in this period, also the sustainability governance emerges, but is still of limited. It's only used to a limited extent, and also the scope might be limited typically. That leads to a phase of increasing use where the market builds up and where you might still have financial incentives in place, and you have more systems. More systems are put in place to deal with the sustainability. So, and also they achieve a broader use. The proliferation of systems has especially been seen in relation to the Renewable Energy Directive from 2009, where certification systems were allowed as a way to show compliance with the legislation, and many new systems were created due to this system. Then we enter a maturity phase with consolidation of the market, and we suggest that this is a time where there's increased uptake of governance systems, and they start to be adjusted as a response to critiques that are put forward or maybe monitoring systems that are in place. And from there, they enter a more cyclic pattern with continuous adaptation, where there's market integration, and again, as new conditions come about or new knowledge emerges, you need to adapt the systems to these new situations. So, trying to depict that or make an interpretation of the systems that are presented to you before and how they enter the loop of this adaptive approach. If we look at the Swedish forest legislation, it started out with the focusing on regeneration and putting that system in place. There are descriptions of that taking time and how that happened. Until the goal changed and being more focused on wood production, and you could perhaps say that the system enters another circle that matured and developed, and more regulations were put in place. With the last one of these requirements being the requirement that a forest management plan must exist, and then changing now to more environmental goals and including that. And during this period, Swedish forest legislation has seen a deregulation, so quite a different trend where all these mandatory requirements were removed, and instead the goals of the management is in the regulations, but the pathway or the methods that forest managers should use, they are voluntary or they are elective. If we look at the biogas, the two biogas studies, we could maybe say that we've got the first systems in place, and the systems are still developing, and we've reached the phase now where those systems are being corrected, and maybe entering a more comprehensive system. The monitoring systems in Germany are still being developed to be comprehensive of the situation. And if we look at this new energy sector regulation for sustainable forest bioenergy, it's only emerging. UK is maybe farther ahead. They have implemented their system, but the Danish system is still being implemented, and the European system has been adopted, but it's not being implemented yet. It's to come still. So another hypothesis is if these phases are linked to different levels of trust and legitimacy of governance. In the emerging phase, maybe both input, output, and throughput legitimacy are low. That's a suggestion. It's maybe a few people that decide how the system should look like, and it's not really been tested yet if they are effective and if they do what they set out to do. As they are increasingly used, we imagine that system, or what we think we can see, is that systems are put in place to try to check if they are effective, and also more focus is on having more democratic contents and more people decide what should be the contents of these standards. Then in the maturing phase, medium output and input legitimacy and a high throughput legitimacy. So systems are getting effective in achieving what they want, and also more transparent and more democratic. And finally, when they reach these more these circles with adjustments, small adjustments, we suggest that the input and output and throughput legitimacies are high until new issues emerge that gets them lower again because new goals or new issues arise. So the question is, how can you, if this is true, the question is also how can you move from one phase to the next? Is there a particular governance design that creates higher or moves us faster to more legitimate systems and higher levels of trust? So this is also a question that we asked ourselves. And the point that is coming out, or what we think we can see for now, is that that if schemes are mandatory or voluntary and how prescriptive they are, that this is not necessarily completely correlated to trust and legitimacy. But it may be related to some extent under some conditions, but not always. But what we can see, as I mentioned earlier as well, is that a mix of approaches is often used. We tried more also to define, or first we tried to define more specifically what we mean by flexibility and prescriptiveness, and this is inspired by a system that was put together by a woman called Constance Dermot and a policy scientist called Benjamin Cashaw. So by flexibility here, we subdivide into three categories. So it can be voluntary systems, or they can be mandatory, or they can be in between. They can be elective, which is what the Swedish forest legislation could be said to be at the moment. It means that goals are set for what should be achieved, but no specific pathway is required to achieve those goals. So they are to be decided by the forest manager. Then the prescriptiveness, we have subdivided into four categories. If we start with the lowest one here, substantive, so that is very specific requirements with thresholds. There can be requirements that something is measured and monitored, and that action must be taken according to what can be seen from that monitoring. There can be requirements of compliance with best management practices, and finally there can be requirements that certain systems are put in place to deal with an issue, but no specific substantive requirements. So it's more procedural requirement. And this system we tried to use, or people tried to use it to classify the governance systems in different for different supply chains and in different geographical settings. So what you can see here is the case study from for forest governance in Ontario, Canada, where it was chosen to focus on residual retention of dead wood material on the site after harvesting, how to manage riparian zones, skidding requirements, and protection of high conservation value forests. And different systems in place in Canada was evaluated here, the stand and site guides, which is part of the governmental governance, FSC, and the indicators that they have put in place now, SFI system and the Canadian Standard Association's Forest Management Certification System as well. And this is just a very preliminary indication of where these requirements sit in the system that I showed you before. The stand and site guides tend to be substantive with quite specific requirements. You can see here, for example, 5 gradient-based area of concern descriptions ranging from 30 to 80 centimeters, and like in the other requirements are of the same type. FSC tends to have less substantive requirements, but require compliance here with best management practices, or that something is being measured, or it can be that some goals are set and then management decides itself how they will achieve these goals. Here maybe the category should be corrected. There seems to be some thresholds here for habitat features, for example. So again, this is just a preliminary assessment that might change when the details have been checked. And you can see the SFI system here again. Maybe a tendency to have more elective requirements, and the CSA more elective, more managerial requirements. So that is the first picture that emerges for this system. If we look at European forest legislation, there was a study made here by Livio Nichiforel and his colleagues that also looked into how strict are the requirements for private forests. Here, the results are showing for forest withdrawal rights, and you can see that requirements in the Nordic countries, for example, tend to be more flexible, that is more voluntary with less requirements, whereas if we have the southeastern Europe, there are many requirements and they tend to be mandatory. And we know from another study that in the Baltic states, for example, requirements have been more mandatory and manifold in the past, but that they have gone through a deregulation phase in the past decades, in the same way as we could see for Sweden. And of course, that makes you ask why does this deregulation take place? Is there what is being achieved when you deregulate, and does that help to increase the trust in the systems and the legitimacy of these systems? And again, in forestry, now I've been talking about legislation, but you could see for Canada, also certification systems are in place and best management practices. We see the same mix of approaches being used also here for agriculture in the U.S. There are regulations in place, conservation incentive programs, so not mandatory inflexible requirements, but more incentives and voluntary. And then best management practices that are also sometimes voluntary, sometimes mandatory, and certification systems as well that can be used by those actors that wishes. And we see the same tendency for biogas in Denmark, for example, that a large mix of governance measures are used, ranging from mandatory legislation to best practices and no strict requirements. We can see it for agriculture and biofuels in Canada, and as we saw before, also for forest governance. So the common hypothesis, and maybe also what some of us thought from the start, was that that when we decrease the flexibility, that means have more mandatory requirements, and when we increase the prescriptiveness, then maybe we also increase the legitimacy and the effectiveness of the governance, and lower the risk of non-compliance. But after having looked at what is happening and what systems are out there, we question if this hypothesis is true. It seems that there could be other factors determining what is most effective. So this is still an open question and something that we will continue to look into if we can see some patterns there, and otherwise probably more studies need to be put in place to see what is effective in this sense. But one thing we can see is that what voluntary approaches for parts of the supply chains, they are gaining acceptance through risk assessments. So when you talk about the risk, it will often have two dimensions, as you can see here. What is the magnitude of the impact that a certain action has? Is it high, medium, low? And what's the likelihood that a certain event will happen? Is it low, medium, or high? And depending on that, you could say that you have a high or a severe risk. And these risk assessments try to assess if there's a high risk or a low risk. And if there's a low risk, less governance is put in place compared to high-risk issues. The places or the issues where these risk-based approaches are increasingly being used is legality. For example, timber legality especially. It's being used for sustainable forest management not in the forest certification systems, but in the systems for sustainable biomass and bioenergy. It's being used to address landscape level effects, forest ecosystem carbon effects, which are very difficult to deal with at the individual forest management unit level. So these issues are some that can benefit from this new approach. If I should shortly explain here what's the difference between the traditional approaches, then in forest certification systems you have the forest owner who is certified, and you have a chain of custody in place that follows the document throughout the supply chain system. In a risk assessment, you only have certification at the biomass producer level, and then you make a risk assessment to see if there are any specific risks among the suppliers in the supplying area. And if there is a risk, then you need extra auditing and mitigation measures. So it means that then things are checked, but they're not checked if the risk is assessed to be low. And here we have a case study of wood pellets in southeastern U.S. And it's interesting to see that even if they have different feedstocks, sourcing strategies, some are mostly focused on primary feedstocks and buying these through wood dealers, and others through loggers, and another type are based on secondary feedstocks. But they still use the same systems to show low risk of their feedstock. Still, there is type 2 here, mainly use certification, whereas there's a wider range in systems that are being used by type 1 producers, and again, more limited use of these risk mitigation systems if it's a secondary feedstock, presumably because they are more often assessed with low risk. Then getting to the point that databases for documentation of sustainability against a multiple of standards are emerging, and that that these existing monitoring systems are increasingly being used for documentation also towards these voluntary sustainability standards. For forestry, there is a sourcing hub by a certification company called NEPCON where you can use the information in that database to show compliance with the EU timber regulation. There is also a build-up of something called the Global Forest Registry, which can be used to help show compliance with FSC control requirements. Next, there is a data transfer system in place for the Sustainable Biomass Program, where they collect data and transmit these through the supply chain. And the data collected there for the individual supply chain can be used. You can withdraw data on greenhouse gases from the system to show compliance with requirements in different countries that still differ. And then also other databases like forest national inventories and other, or maybe biodiversity spatial data are also increasingly being used for these risk assessments. And I should mention here also that a workshop is being planned for San Francisco, 5th of November, to explore the state of the art of such data, what exists and what are the data gaps, and how can we use the existing data better. We can see, it was another surprise that we can see that such data are also being collected for agricultural systems, for example in Canada here, where 13 long-term goals have been set for sustainable development, and there is reporting against these goals, and there is environmental monitoring at different levels taking place, and also there are voluntary sustainability networks that build up databases also to provide documentation against different standards. So especially this part is driven by markets. Different markets require that different standards are met, and so systems are put in place by these different roundtables to deal with that. Another type of knowledge that is needed is also to know something about the profitability of energy crops and energy feedstock production. And here's a case study from Iowa, where a spatial analysis has been made to see where it could be profitable to integrate energy crops with the conventional crops, and also where it could be profitable due to reduced nutrient loading of the waters. So again, getting back also to the more holistic view on sustainability, we also need to look at those systems that are financially viable and need data for this type of information. So ending the presentation here with the recommendations coming out of this study, we need to define the concepts and terms that we use in a clear way to be able to communicate sustainability to the public and to the stakeholders, and among them. We should take a more holistic approach to sustainability standards and include criteria for renewable energy systems and the financial viability as well, in order to make that come together and not sit in two separate spaces. We should put in place adaptive frameworks with data monitoring platforms and or stakeholder communication platforms that can help to act with due diligence in these arenas that are where great complexity is embedded. This is needed as markets develop, and the governance systems, they have to develop also through those phases of market development. It's not a static system. Then we suggest also that studies are initiated to explore which mix of governance means that are most efficient, cost efficient, and effective on the ground in different conditions. That's not very clear from this study. Then we suggest that the use of risk-based approaches, that's an opportunity to obtain more cost-efficient and equally effective sustainability documentation compared to mandatory systems with prescriptive requirements for individual actors in the supply chain. And finally, we also suggest to explore the opportunities to use the existing databases for documentation of sustainability, and also identifying where the gaps are so that these can develop for the future. So thank you very much for your attention, and I would welcome any questions and comments on these topics.
All right,
Thanks, Inga.
Very much.
Over to you, Ronnie.
Yep, absolutely. So I will now unmute the lines for a question and answer period.
So Ronnie, and tell us.
The leader has turned lecture off, and your lines have been unmuted.
All right, so to ask a question over the phone, please state your name, where you are calling from, and then address the question. We also recommend directing any questions towards the chat pod in the middle of the screen. We will also be setting up a poll to look at the, all right, here we go. Which of the following best represents the nature of your work, just to try to understand where our audiences are coming from. And then over to you, Tat, to moderate the question and answer period.
Thanks very much, Ronnie. So colleagues will understand that you have the possibility of typing your question in the chat line, and we'll work. I'll try to help you work with Inga to answer your questions. Where we need to, we could also direct your attention back to any particular slide that you'd like to ask. So I see somebody, Rob's got 3 questions. And Ronnie, tell us again how it's meant to work on the phones. Hopefully colleagues can hear me speaking. Can we also hear them speak now if they have a question they'd like to direct to Inga?
Yes, absolutely. Right now I've unmuted the lines, so people who have dialed in, they should be able to ask your questions over the phone. We just ask that you state your name, where you are calling from, and then address the question.
Okay, thanks for that reminder. So I see Rob has 3 questions. First one's related to slide 37. On what basis did you determine legitimacy as low, medium, and high? I think that relates to the, must be related to the development phases there from, we're looking at the development of governance and these sectors over time.
Oops.
And then Ronnie, we may have to have you move the, or can I move the chat box here so that colleagues can see the, there we go. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Rob, Inga?
Yes, I should say that that this is work in progress. So the first take on that was from a study of core certification systems, but I could see those maybe being modified or at least nuanced. Also, there are other studies that suggest that this might be needed to have a hypothesis that is more likely. What we can see in some of these emerging phases, for example, is also that if you put too much governance in place, it can be an inhibitor for developing systems. So maybe there's a reason that that you have less in the beginning, and this is something that we need to look more into. So these this is not set in stone for sure. So So anything that can nuance this and maybe modify it, and maybe there is, maybe it doesn't even exist to the extent, this pattern to the extent that is presented here. So yeah, any feedback on this would be welcomed.
Yeah, so the point you're making is this is a hypothesis for the way this would work, and that we could drill into that. I think I was wanting to maybe work through some more of Rob's questions. Rob, you had a question here about whether we're directly comparing the EU with the U.S. biofuel sustainability criteria in this project. You want to comment on that, Inga? The way in which
yeah, I can say that we have not done that yet. So these studies are still being worked on. So this is the preliminary results, and but we're working on a synthesis paper. So this is the first take on putting things together and looking across those different case studies. So I would say this is something that is desirable, and I could see that it would be for many reasons. Then it's probably something that we should try to include and see what how that compares. It has not been done yet.
We've talked with colleagues as to whether or not there's unique situations have developed in one particular jurisdiction over another, and so there could be differences. But we'll be looking for commonalities as well as differences and why those are important. Maybe just one last question from Rob here, asking for you to comment on how the recommendations, probably the last slide, are linked specifically to this issue of trust. So that's a good question about the test of the arguments you've made here and how well these recommendations is probably on slide 53 there.
Yeah. So some of the things we've discussed is that that much of the confusion and the disagreement that is out there arise actually because concepts and terms are not well defined and clearly defined. So if you understand different things by the same term, then you will inevitably disagree in the end. So we need to agree more, have more, you could say, global understandings of the different concepts and terms. So in that sense, I would see that agreeing on these terms and definitions, that's a precondition for achieving trust, more trust. So we need to discuss that more, what we mean by sustainability, for example, and also that they can actually differ. It's not always the same thing. And for this holistic approach, what became clear to us is that actually some of the financial incentives to develop bioenergy, they are put in place to achieve sustainability goals. But very often it seems as something different from sustainability. So when we want to make look at the whole picture, we should also, you could say, force people to see it in the same standard somehow, to see it in the same context. That if you want to achieve the sustainability goals that can be achieved with forest bioenergy or with biogas or biofuels, then you need to look at that together with the trade-offs and make those priorities, and also see what you lose if you choose not to use biofuels, for example. So having that assessment in a more coherent and holistic manner, that's what we suggest, and that it might help us all see more clearly what we maybe gain, where we are now very focused on the undesired effects of bioenergy production. And then the adaptive frameworks, I think that recognizing that the dynamics of these systems, that might create confidence also that they will adapt over time, and that if there is something unintended taking place and something which develops in a different way than expected, then there are systems in place that can help to capture that and adjust, so that you don't need to be so worried about all the unintended effects. So in that sense, I also think that an adaptive approach can help to create more trust systems. And yeah, and then of course the design of the systems, I'm more in doubt about that. Maybe it needs to be, we need more knowledge about what is effective in which conditions, to be able also to say that what designs we need in different places. So there's not much knowledge about that, so you can discuss that for a very, very long time, what is most effective, because there's actually not very much knowledge about that. So having more knowledge to build on for that discussion, I think that could also help to build more trust if you know more about what's effective in which situations. And then of course these risk assessments, I especially think that they can be more cost efficient. So you might say that we can achieve more by checking everything, but probably if you think again for the priorities for society, it's a question how much we want to put into this compared to what are the risks. So somehow explaining that and communicating that we need to focus our control and our governance on where the risks are, communicating that and applying systems that do that, I also think that can help increase the trust in what is going on. And then of course having data that are suitable and available and that people can check and see even, that also helps to create trust in what you see. So we were talking to somebody, I think yesterday, that mentioned that all the US FAI data, that they are available online, so everybody can access these and check everything yourself. So that can also help to create trust if you have access to the data that assessments are based on, and you can transparently see how the assessments are being made.
Thanks, Inga. That maybe helps clarify what the logic is in the way in which the argument's made there. What I might do is direct your attention to a question that Keith Klein asked. Thanks, Keith. And Keith has a question related to risk-based approaches that I see some other people commenting on here. And Keith's asking about asking if you could describe the perceived costs and benefits of these risk approaches.
The perceived cost?
In some way, it kind of relates to throughput legitimacy, as I see the question being worded here. Cost and benefits.
Yeah.
Maybe also output legitimacy.
Yeah. So I can just give you my impressions, which are that that generally the risk assessments are seen as more cost efficient than forest certification, for example. And also that it's a cost that especially the larger companies can manage. So where certification gets difficult to manage because of the size of the actors is at the sawmill level, the forest owner level, and that's where risk assessments then are useful because these actors do not have to get certified. So energy companies and pellet plants, they can bear these costs. That's my general impression, at least, especially the larger ones. And of course, the smaller the producer, the more problematic it will be, also because of the knowledge that is needed to put these systems in place. What is especially can be troublesome is when mitigation measures should be put in place. That is when a certain issue is assessed with high risk, because that means you need more auditing, and that means that the pellet mill will need to go to the field to maybe interview or check loggers, sawmills, check things maybe several times per year. So for some mills, that is an additional cost, an administrative burden that is maybe they would be happy to get rid of. And this is also why it's so important with these data sets, that to the extent that you can actually you have maybe national data sets in place that can show that there is a low risk, that is very helpful for these companies because it means that they don't have the burden of checking themselves. We often, when criteria is assessed with specified risk, it doesn't mean that there is a high risk, but it means you cannot document that the risk is low. So if you can document in some other way, more in a more regional level or national level, that the risk is low, then it will help. So developing data and also mitigating issues at a higher level, that will help.
Yeah, thanks Inga. There's a question from BL that what I was trying to do is pick a question that's maybe dealing with things at a technical level, and then we can scale up at some point to address questions asked about things at a pretty high level. BL's asked a question related to the kind of comparing the U.S. with what's described as an attractive system in terms of regulation with the RI-RINs under the renewable fuel standard. And then question asking, I'm not quite sure the wording here, what we have in the EU as an extra incentive. Could you comment on maybe what is starting to emerge from these analyses that might compare U.S. regulatory system with the EU system there? I know this is something we intend to get into. Maybe we're ready to get into that now, or maybe not. Turn it to you, Inga.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question entirely. So I mean incentives for bioenergy and which provides them the highest incentives to use bioenergy.
So BL, we might ask you to come back with a little bit expansion on that. What I might I'm seeing some questions that come out here from Mark Londo and from Maria Wellish that deal with you know, the if you will, the preponderance of regulatory issues. You know, we've got big systems in place, and one question might be, how do we kind of prioritize? How do we get some efficiencies? Mark is raising issues related to the urgency of making progress, and yet in the face of quick public judgment, but also long, probably tedious processes. Your description of going around the circle, I love the diagram of the circles, and you kind of come back around and iterate through on the Swedish forest sustainability standards. But it is a long process. There's no question about that. And the question is, how do we, Mark's asking, how do we overcome this conundrum? How do we overcome the issues of the urgency and the need to ask and the speed of public reaction vis-a-vis the long, tedious, slow process that's involved here? Do you want to comment on that?
Yes. Of course, it's important to have these processes where goals are set and that they are comprehensive and inclusive. But I do see this mix of systems, legislative, mandatory systems, and more voluntary systems as a way to deal with this. We can see that these voluntary systems, they can sometimes develop very quickly. They can rapidly take off because less people are sometimes, or actors are sometimes involved. So it's faster to make decisions and make progress. And then they can consolidate over time. We can see that the SPP is right now in a transition from being an energy company system. You could say it has been started by a range of European energy companies. Now they are changing to more towards multi-stakeholder governance. So they are going to have a stakeholder board, and the whole governance structure is changing to more input legitimacy, so you could say. But they did put the systems in place before that and got started with the whole process so that they could operate maybe legitimacy, and you could say that's maybe where the model that we have on the screen now, where it fits that maybe input legitimacy was low because it was only energy companies that were behind the SPP system. but it's developing over time now. So having this mix of things that are voluntary and that can be put in place quite quickly, and they can also adjust quite quickly to the experiences that are gained, and then with something more constant and changing more slowly that sits at a more mandatory level might be a way to deal with that.
So yeah, thanks. And so that helps explain how a variety of actors with various incentives to various motivations, like maybe use that word, to kind of act and to move forward and have progress, sometimes kind of speed up the evolution of these systems. Other actors may tend to function on different speeds, different time frames. Just want to acknowledge, thanks Veronica for directing our attention to some papers related to trust in bioenergy systems and issues related to that. So thanks. And I guess I could ask Ronnie to help us all understand how the content of this webinar, including the voice, the audio portion, is going to be made available to either participants or the public, and whether these comments and questions that are being typed in with providing these links to papers, will those be available to us as a long-term archive? Ronnie, how's that all work?
Yes, absolutely. So all of the material today is recorded and will be published on the IEA Bioenergy webinar website, in which I will post a link to, and then people can just visit that link to access the material. It will be made available and to everyone and to the public in just a couple of days.
Okay, thanks for clarifying. So that's a good resource and should provide us with long-term access to the material here. So thanks Veronica for that and others. Looking back through the questions, I was seeing VL was typing at some point, but I don't see that coming up yet. So maybe we'll still wait for some clarification of that. Keith may be keen to get back into looking at circles on slide 36 for steps 3 and 4. Could they be better described as evaluating and improving rather than correcting and comprehensive? I guess we can take a look at that and see how we might answer that, whether we want to continue online or we could go offline and chat more with Keith. But so steps 3 and 4.
Yes, I should say maybe that I could say that the wording here is not. It's put in place by me when I put together this presentation, so it's not something that we've all been discussing. All of the people involved that you saw there on the list. So definitely there could be some issues around the exact wording that might mean something and make more sense.
So
yeah.
yes, thanks, Inga. So I might add that Keith, thanks for that question, and any of the colleagues on the line will recognize that going back to Inga's very first point on the recommendations in this webinar is a great deal of attention on concepts and terms and terminology, and clearly even on this call across everybody here, we've got a wide variety of backgrounds and disciplines represented here. The way we use words can differ, and so in this work that we're doing, this is quite a rich collaboration, and so and these concepts that Inga is talking about here today are ones that we're working with, developing hypotheses, and definitely keen to have more discussion on finding the best way to describe what we're talking about. In some cases, there could be several words that could be chosen, but first we need to agree on what the concepts are, what they mean, and then on the branding for that, or the terminology. So thanks, Keith. Your suggestion is quite helpful in the way in which we can anticipate then more dialogue on that. Great. I'm scanning through the questions here. Thanks, Luke Duckmans, for providing the link there for IEA Bioenergy webinars, so colleagues will know where to find that, and also through the CIF. Ronnie, thanks for providing that link there. Inga, can you see the questions as well? I think we're doing pretty well on working our way through them, and I don't see any questions that perhaps we've not addressed. Although I might go back to Maria Wellish's a little bit more carefully here, talking about sustainability issues growing and the need to prioritize actions. The risk-based decision-making might help. Maybe also helpful to have access to several instruments where governments might be more responsive, able to adapt in an appropriate time frame. You want to pick up on some of that, Inga, maybe as a final series of closing remarks and how we see this maybe moving forward through time?
Yes, I mean it's kind of follows from what I said to Mark Londo also for his comment there, that we can see this mix of systems being used, and maybe there is a good reason for that it's not either or, but it's and. That we need to have more systems in place. Some needs to be responsive, and maybe we can live with a little less input legitimacy in order for these systems to be responsive, and then over time maybe consolidate them for a higher legitimacy. But again, that you need this mix of systems to be able to navigate with the sustainability when the market is developed. So maybe that is even an issue that we should try to develop more also conceptually. So yeah, that's quite interesting, because it's actually exactly the part where we've maybe been a bit confused with what is most effective here. So maybe moving away from mandatory or voluntary, but rather looking at or substantive or procedural, but that and a good mix is needed for several reasons.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Inga. Well, I think we've reached. Seeing a comment here. Thanks, Virginia, for your comment. Slides could refer to making progress towards sustainability, other than ensuring it. So thanks very much for your suggestion. So Inga, I think we've reached the end of questions coming in, and I'll just thank you for all the efforts you've put into pulling this presentation together, helping to provide leadership for as everybody can see, for a diverse array of colleagues here. We really enjoy the work, and looking forward to pushing towards the workshop in 5 November in San Francisco, and the end of triennium meetings there for IEA Bioenergy in San Francisco. Also working with colleagues to publish papers and write the synthesis report. So I thank you. And do you have any final closing remarks you'd like to make, Inga, before we turn it back to Ronnie to close her down?
I don't think so, but I can see that Luke announces the next webinar on Wednesday, 17th of October, on the topic assessing biorefinery systems. So that's maybe a final remark, that there is another topic coming up here, and then of course the workshop in San Francisco. Yeah. And we are of course also happy to receive any comments after this webinar. If you get to think of things, please write to us if you have some inputs or ideas or critiques.
Thanks very much. So Ronnie, back over to you in terms of any closing remarks. Well, thank you very much.
Oh, absolutely. So if there are no more questions, I would like to bring this session to an official close. Thank you all to all of the people who have participated in today's webinar. And once again, thank you very much to Inga and Tat for the wonderful presentation. So this was the IEA Bioenergy webinar series hosted by the Canadian Institute of Forestry, and we hope you have a great day. Thank you all.